how did George Washington get along with the Native Americans who lived here before him?
Hey, thanks so much for the question. George Washington lived in an Indian world. I want you to imagine for a moment that you are a young George Washington in the 1750s on a visit to, say, Williamsburg, Virginia, or Philadelphia, cities both built on native land. As you walk the streets, you might have encountered many peoples like the Cherokee, the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois, the Delaware, perhaps even the Miami, more commonly known in English as the Miami. They might have been in town to negotiate with colonial government officials, trade with white merchants, or complain to colonial governors about white settlers moving on to their lands. But by the time Washington was president of the United States in the 1790s, appearances by native peoples in these places were less common, and you would have had to have gone further west into the North American interior to hear their voices. And there was less of a chance that the land you traveled over as you moved west was still Indian land. More likely, you would have seen white settlers farming land that had once belonged to native peoples. Over the course of his life, Washington played a major role in bringing about this change. His relationship with Native Americans is very complicated, but we can think about it in a couple of different ways. One has to do with war and diplomacy. As a soldier in the French and Indian War, Washington worked with native peoples like Tanahumrison, a Seneca, as they battled with the French and their Indian allies over control of what British colonists called the Ohio Country. This was a vast swath of territory as large as France, with rich soil that many white colonists wanted for agriculture. Many years later, during the American War for Independence, Washington and other Americans rebelled against Great Britain in part because they wanted access to these lands. Washington himself claimed a right to several thousand acres in the Ohio Country. And during that war, Washington, as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, authorized military campaigns against native peoples like the Iroquois as part of American efforts to defeat Great Britain. We also have to keep in mind, though, that as much as the Revolution was a war for American independence, it was also a war for Native independence. Native peoples well knew that the creation of the United States could lead to further loss of their homelands and their culture. In fact, in the early 1790s, when Washington was president, an alliance of Miami and Shawnee Indians resisted American expansion into what is now Ohio and Indiana, and they successfully destroyed several American armies before their defeat at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. But other peoples like the Creeks negotiated treaties with the new United States and agreed to give up some land in exchange for ensuring their ability to control other lands. Now, land is a theme here, as you might have noticed, and it has a lot to do with the second way that Washington's relationship with Native peoples was very complicated. Washington and other white Americans thought that Native peoples should give up their traditional agricultural practices and farm like white people. In many Native societies, land was owned by the entire community, and women did most of the agricultural work. But white people believed that property should be owned by individuals, and that farming ought to be a man's profession, even if in Washington's case he made enslaved men and women work his fields. Washington and others wanted Native peoples to adopt this agricultural way of life, and if they refused, give up, or were forced to give up their lands, white settlers believed that they could make better use of the land than Indians could. These kinds of attitudes led to a very long history of Native peoples losing their lands in a process we call dispossession. This continued long after Washington's death in 1799. Native peoples lost much of their land and were often forced to give up much of their culture. Today, many Native peoples in the United States no longer live on the same lands as their 18th century ancestors did. But using the power of the law, education, and digital technology, many, like my friends at the Miami Project at Miami University, are working very hard to recover some of what has been lost. Washington's Indian world changed dramatically over the course of his life. I hope you'll want to learn more about how and why as you continue your own journey. And to get you started, I'd like to recommend a book by my colleague, Colin G. Calloway, called The Indian World of George Washington, the First President, the First Americans, and the Birth of the Nation. Thanks again for your question.
Click the subscribe button below and the bell icon to get notifications for new videos about George Washington and behind-the-scenes work at Mount Vernon.